I am going to try to moderate this as little as possible. I really would love to just be able to hand it off to you guys to have a conversation about zoning. And then with time, we can open it up to questions. And I imagine you guys probably are mostly on the same side of this issue, but I know that that's not a universal thing in the libertarian space. So particularly if there is someone in the audience who loves zoning and thinks that, like, you're taking away our local control and you got a problem with that, this would be a great time to ask a question and engage in conversation on it. So so your microphones are there. Feel free to turn them on. And I'm just going to hand it over to you guys. If you guys start, like, fist fighting or something, I'll intercede. But, anyway, I figure you guys
That would be great TV, though.
What's that?
That would be great TV, though.
It would be great TV, and we are recording, so, All right. Andrew, if you want to throw in an ad hominem or something to keep it spicy.
I will, but I was just monologuing and blustering for the last 30 minutes. So, Jason, why don't you kick it off?
All right. Well, I think probably the way this conversation might go is we might start probing to find areas where we do disagree.
Okay.
But I think to start things off, maybe I'll make the claim that zoning is indefensible, but we shouldn't abolish it. And so here's what I mean by that. So let me explain the first part. So here's why I think zoning is indefensible. First of all, one of the possible libertarian justifications of zoning would be, well, what if local governments are just private associations? And so zoning is just a private association enforcing its private rules. That's the wrong way to think about local governments. Local governments are creatures of state governments. They didn't have the zoning authority until, in New Hampshire, 1925. So let's see, we got our first constitution in 1785, right? So 140 years of history where this was not a power of local governments. And then the state, under a campaign led by many progressives in the federal government, including Herbert Hoover, urged states to pass these uniform state enabling acts, zoning enabling acts. And New Hampshire passed ours in 1925. And that granted this new power that these local governments previously didn't have. And they used that power to take away land uses from property owners. And if we think about the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees a right to compensation in cases of the government taking property, we should really think about zoning as a regulatory taking. There's not much difference between the government saying you have to use the land exactly the way we want you to use it and just taking the land and using it that way themselves. So we should really require local governments to compensate property owners if they take away uses of the land that diminish their property value. And so that's what zoning does. Now, zoning was a response to real concerns that people had, especially with the development of the automobile, the expansion of trucking into suburban areas. People wanted to keep heavy industry and warehouses and stuff out of residential neighborhoods. But there is a private sector solution to that is common in many places, including in Houston, Texas, the only major city that doesn't have zoning and where I grew up. Private covenants, right? So you can have people, property owners, get together and say, well, I won't do X with my land if you agree not to do X with your land, and we'll sign a contract, and that contract will run with the land. So anyone I rent or sell to will be under that same restriction. And maybe there's a period where these contracts have to be renewed, like every 40 years or whatever. If you don't renew them, they go away. That is the kind of free market, private property rights, libertarian solution to land use externalities, as economists call them. It's kind of a wonky term for the fact that the way I use my land could affect the value of your land, right? And so we can use private covenants to deal with that. Obviously, we can use nuisance law to deal with that. So if you are actually making loud noises at 2 a.m., blowing air horns, next to my property, I can sue you for creating a nuisance. And I actually, being a minarchist, don't have a problem with local governments having noise ordinances and things like that, and regulating air pollution and things like that are violations of, essentially, of your property rights, right? Noise and pollution that's entering effectively your body. So those are the solutions: private covenants, tort law, and nuisance codes. Those are the solutions to the problems that zoning was intended to solve, and actually zoning doesn't solve them all that well. Now that we have had zoning for 100 years this year in New Hampshire, you couldn't just abolish it all at once, in my view, because zoning has atrophied those private solutions to land use externalities over time. And so what we need to do is instead create some guardrails using the state legislature can do this, the courts can do this, to basically say, there's some ridiculous things we're not going to let you do with zoning because you are violating people's property rights with this. And then second of all, I think you should find ways to let people opt out of zoning. Let private communities opt out of land use regulation and control their own land use regulation. Let individual city blocks decide what their zoning will be, regardless of what the city says, right? Those are things you can start to do to kind of peel away the centrally planned nature of zoning and get us back more toward a private solution. So yeah, zoning is indefensible, but we can't just abolish it.
I agree with most of that, but I'm going to try to find ways to fight you to make it interesting. So I'll look for some conflict here. I'll add a bit too. I agree that zoning did come about in part to deal with real issues. I also think zoning was largely racist bullshit when it happened. Like you look at California, the first zoning laws they had in California were dealing with laundry. And you think, well, okay, chemicals, all right. No, it's Chinese. That's what they were trying to deal with. They were trying to make sure Chinese people couldn't live in the town. And you look at Los Angeles today, beautiful city, real big pancake. It's kind of the shape of a pancake. It just keeps bubbling out. The reason for that initially, and I don't think this is an active phenomenon today, but the bellus loci of that was that back during the Federal Housing Administration era of the New Deal era, people were worried that black people were going to move into town. That was a very, very worrisome thing. So what they would do is they would ban apartment buildings because they figured, well, black people live in apartment buildings. That was part of the thought process, and wanted it to go to covenants. The idea being that covenants could go, well, we only let safe people live in our neighborhood. And so they basically just banned apartment buildings as a way to deal with this. And it never really went away. California's done a little bit to chip away at that they deserve some credit for here recently. They've allowed accessory dwelling units, which takes some amount of heat off of the constricture of supply. But that, a lot of the time, there were malignant forces that were at work to do all of that. And I particularly hate zoning, not even so much as an affront to freedom. I'm going to let Jason cover the affront to freedom bit. I'm really bothered by homelessness. It really bothers me. I think it's screwed up that in the most affluent country in the history of the world, we will step over a prone figure on a sidewalk in a regular, that is unconscionable to me that that's happening in America. And a significant part of that is because we have a fascist zoning system where we've intentionally decided to restrict the amount of housing that can exist, and weirdly, restricting the supply of housing in order to make the housing, we've decided to restrict the supply of housing to make everybody's house worth more, and it didn't occur to anybody when you make houses worth more, you also increase the cost. Now, nobody in this room would have been blindsided by that, but this is something America continues to be flabbergasted by, that if you intentionally drive up the cost of housing, housing costs more. Who'd have thought? Well, that's zoning doing that. When you look at a map, any major city in the United States, 80% of the city, you cannot do anything other than single-family dwelling units. You're forbidden by law to build a apartment complex or a duplex or a triplex. And so while homelessness is very, very complex stuff, there's lots of different ways people become homeless. There's lots of things we got to do there. The main thing, if we're going to pick one deal, is there are a lot of functional people that get priced out of the market. Something bad happens, they pop a tire, they don't go to work, they're gone. And that's something that we can fix. We don't even have to do anything. We just have to quit restricting people's freedom. And the pushback that I tend to get on that, because I'm fairly emphatic on this, is, like I've got a lot of equity in my house, and I hear what you're saying, but I don't want to, I put all this value into my house. And my response is twofold. One, I'm sorry, I don't know how to say this. You don't get to restrict my property to make your house cost more. I want you to do well, but that hurts my pocketbook is not a sufficiently good argument to hurt other people's freedom. Done. But then the secondary order of that is, let's say you don't agree with me. I suspect that you all are probably pretty open to that argument. If you don't agree with me on that, I was in Austin, Texas the last 5 years, and I would talk to people about that, where they're like, listen, I also care about the poor, but I want my house value to be good. You know what's not great for housing value? Having a bunch of homeless people knife fighting in your backyard. Having literal human waste you step over in San Francisco is not great for what you want to do. So I think that there's really big problems with the zoning that we've got in the country. Where we can maybe fight, is I do think there should be some zoning, but I think that it should be very, very limited in terms of what it's going to do. So I host a program called The Political Orphanage, and last year I did a whole week on city stuff. I brought on urban planners, I brought on mayors, I brought on the great Alain Berthoud. If you don't know Alain Berthoud, he's amazing. He is a hero to those of us that are concerned about zoning. And in talking to Alain, he made a case like, look, you need to have certain things here. I was open to the whole let everybody figure out their own roads bit. He went, I get that philosophically, but you're not going to have good roads. You're going to have really zigzaggy roads. You need to have some amount of government there. And then where I would channel him is, I'm perfectly fine having zoning laws to regulate, we're not going to have an arms factory next to a school. Okay. If there's something really dangerous, maybe not put that next to a residential zone. That's fine. We are orders of magnitude away from that kind of light touch. We're not zoning based on negative externalities, which I think are legitimate. We're not zoning based on safety, which I think is legitimate. The zoning regime in the United States exists in 3 capacities: racism, driving up housing prices and making housing cost more, and also because we have a bunch of pointy-headed leaders that played SimCity too much. And they think that everything has to be organized, and that if it's not organized, that people will be like mowing their hedges instead of their lawns, and like parking boats in the street, or some gobbledygook like that. The reality is that's not going to happen. You can rely on emergent order 95% of the time. People will sort things out. If they don't want to live in a congested part of town, then they won't live in a congested part of town. It'll take care of itself. So I think the zoning ought to be dramatically repealed. I'm curious, Jason, where you went was, you think kind of beef up covenants, property rights. Would you entirely remove zoning? Would you get to the point where you have no zoning and it's all covenants? Where would your end point be?
I think it has to be gradual, but I would like to get there, and I think we can. In fact, I think we can deal with the glue factory example. So did you talk to Nolan Gray or read his book?
I did, hold on. I'm aware of Nolan Gray. I don't think I talked to Nolan Gray.
So he's got this book called Arbitrary Lines, and so I'm giving full credit because it's not original to me. He came up with this idea. Actually, he didn't come up with it, but he pointed out that you don't need zoning. In fact, zoning is often not helpful for dealing with the glue factory problem. All you need is an ordinance that says you can't open a glue factory within 1,000 feet of a residence.
Yeah, okay.
Right? Right now, you might have an industrial zone right next to a residential zone, and you can build a glue factory right next to a house so long as it's right across that arbitrary line that sets the zoning district. So in fact, dealing with the externalities might mean getting rid of zoning and having instead a more thoughtful set of ordinances to deal with these externalities.
Conceded.
Yeah.
Good point. Wow. Okay. All right. Well, I've come around on the zoning there. No zoning. No zoning at all. That was real hard.
I wonder if now might be a good time to open things up to questions. But I did want to respond first to something Andrew said. SimCity is very boring if you're a libertarian.
Yeah, it's real boring if you're a libertarian.
Anyway, we'll open it up to questions. Please come up to the microphone.
Thank you.
Make sure it's on.
Thank you. So on the making housing too expensive and the homelessness thing, I know zoning has a big impact on the cost of housing, but there's a lot of other things. I'm wondering if there's any information or study on the relative impact of building codes and maybe some occupational licensing on trades, because the legislature were involved in building codes, and I think that has at least some impact of some significance in making housing more expensive. Just quick background, I mean, I grew up in Chicago. There used to be the tenements, where even if somebody's kind of a bum, you could make enough money to have a little single room thing and a bathroom down the hall, and those you can't build those now.
Yeah. Yeah, the answer is yes, absolutely yes. There's multiple things going on. You allude to a real problem, which is there are a lot of well-meaning, pointy-headed people that go, no one should ever live in such abysmal conditions. We'll outlaw that. That's weird. Now we have a lot of homeless people. I call this the stepladder fallacy. TM, Andrew Heaton, the stepladder fallacy, where there's a ladder and the bottom rung is got gum on it. No one wants to step on it. So we just kick it loose and it doesn't exist anymore. And we go, well, that problem's solved. No, because now everybody that was going to be on that rung's on the floor. So that's a big problem. You look like I lived in New York City for 5 years. And New York City, same thing. It used to have a lot more different options there. I forget the name of the term, but there was a very common form of housing in New York City for SROs. Thank you. That's basically where you're kind of like in a dorm, where you had several people and you had your own bedroom, but maybe you'd have a kitchen. The other thing I would add is the building codes. Yes, that's a really relevant thing. So in New York City, it costs 4 times as much money to build an elevator as it does in Switzerland. I've been to Switzerland a couple of times. There aren't elevators like falling out of the sky in Switzerland, but there's so many safety regulations. I'm okay with some amount of safety regulations, but there are trade-offs, and the trade-off is that it costs a lot more. This is one of the big problems that we have with affordable housing, is when we try to build affordable housing, like in California, one, you get a glut, like Los Angeles has $1.4 billion for affordable housing right now. They can't do anything with it, because whenever they try to build anything, the local neighborhood goes, listen, we care about poor people, but our neighborhood, blah, 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 has, aesthetic choices, so they won't let them zone it. And then the other thing is it ends up being where the average cost to build affordable housing is like $800,000 per unit. Like, I bought a $6,000 camper that I could live out of. Like, I could fix this tomorrow. The floor recognizes Gene Epstein.
I have a high respect for both you guys, but if I were to parody you both, given my strong feelings about zoning laws, and for example, the thing I didn't think you mentioned, which is that it contributes greatly to inequality of income. If you're a $50,000 a year earner, $40,000 a year earner, it's difficult to move to some of those high-rent cities like the Cockamamie city I live in. If you're over 100K, you can generally get by and you get the better job. So it screws up so much. And if I were to parody you guys, you'd say, well, maybe marriage laws should be tightened. Look at all the unhappy marriages. Shouldn't the government get a little bit more involved? Isn't it terrible that somebody who is in the glue business is poisoning his wife? We want the government to worry about that. Well, guys, I want to remind you, back in Roman times, they had nuisance laws, they had tort law. It was been thought about for a long time. And why does a libertarian like me prefer the courts to bring cases, to bring preventative laws? If you're putting up a building that is unsafe, you can bring a case against that building. Now that too will be messy, just like human life is messy. There'll be screw-ups and all the rest. But if you create bureaucracies that do zoning, if you tell the state it can zone, it's going to do the sort of things that Andrew talks about. So let's go cold turkey, and why don't you guys grow up and recognize that life will, even a libertarian society, life will be a little bit screwed up. So that's all. But again, I want to insist again that there's nuisance laws, there's tort laws, there's restraining laws. In other words, if you have a building and they're putting up something that could fall on you, all of the courts are better equipped, because when you create bureaucracies, they look for things to do and they start creating havoc, and especially economic havoc. The difficulty that people of limited means have to move to high-wage cities, the big point, the big problem. So please, give up on this bullshit about let's have a little bit of zoning. Just recognize life will always be imperfect, guys.
I really enjoyed doing this because I've seen Gene do this so many times in the Soho Forum debates. Was there a question there?
Don't you guys agree with me?
Yes, I agree with Gene, yeah.
To me, it's a little bit like the immigration issue. I worry that if we had open borders tomorrow, we'd end up with actually less immigration in the long run, because the political backlash would be so huge. In the same way, like abolishing zoning right away, I think there's a political backlash to that. But you're absolutely right. in a lot of cases, what building codes are mandating is simply what the market would provide anyway. And where it's mandating something else, it's actually doing the stupid elevator stuff and the single stair stuff, and it's making housing more costly for no purpose. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it depends on what we're talking about cold turkey. If we're talking about zoning, I think I'm fine with going cold turkey on zoning. And that's the thing, because I'm like a limp-wristed cuck guy. And even I'm like, yeah, just get rid of them. I agree. We could do the externality noise violation thing.
All right, I'm a committed YIMBY, so I've been advocating for making it easier to build housing for about 10 years. I'm excited that Austin has a supermajority city council of YIMBYs, and we've been rolling back restrictions and supporting single stair and things like that.
Are you down in Austin?
Yeah.
Great.
I want to plug the Center for Building in North America, which gets into the plans and the wonky stuff. Anyway, something I struggle with a little bit, and I want to hear your thoughts on, is there's a category of externalities which is difficult to account for in policy because it's sort of stochastic and punctuated. And you think about an example, you can dismiss this as FUD, but it's something to speak on at least, which is like you have lower income people move in the neighborhood, and then someone, stochastically randomly, has a pit bull that escapes their yard and mauls your child. Part of the exclusionary zoning is motivated by situations like this, criminality, et cetera. So certainly we need like criminal justice to defend against that, but also I guess maybe the associations would be enough to accommodate that kind of issue.
There are going to be problems from moving away from a zoning regime. I don't disagree on that. I would always just look at like net positive versus net negative. I think if the net negative is housing costs more for everybody and we have way more homeless people, and also I can't walk down the street to get coffee because it's been SimCity zoned away, I think that those are sufficient to go, okay, that's probably the worst case scenario. The other one I would say is like, there was a complex question, I'm probably being needlessly reductive in answering it, but I think that it is using zoning as a proxy for something else, which is frequently what zoning is. I mean, zoning is a lot of the time an excuse to make poor people not live in my neighborhood. That's why we have minimum lot sizes. Is poor people like smaller homes, big people like, or rich people like bigger homes. With the pit bull thing, which is funny because Wallace is, he's a Latvian fluke hound, which is a breed I made up, because he's part pit, he's fine. I think that the way to do that would be to deal with the actual issue head on. If the concern is dangerous breeds in the neighborhood, then have a rule about dangerous breeds in the neighborhood. Don't try to go, well, poor people like pit bulls, so we'll have minimum lot sizes to make sure that poor people don't move into because our neighborhood tends to be Presbyterians that like golden retrievers. Just have a thing about dangerous dogs would be the way to go, I think.
The Steelman case for some of this zoning is, local governments are responsible for providing public schools free of charge. And if you allow a bunch of families to move in, that's going to raise the property tax burden locally. So we can discriminate against, especially if you believe that, you should discriminate against single-family homes actually, because that's where families with kids like to move. And obviously, the solution to this is privatize the schools. But the second solution is, well, it's kind of a zero-sum game. Like if my town pushes out the kids, that's pushing them to another town. So really, we should just lay down our arms and let the kids live where they want to live, and we can all kind of share that burden in the meantime.
So just so everyone knows, including folks at the mic, we have a hard time limit of about 4-ish minutes. So if we're going to get through the questions, let's make sure it's a quick question and not a Gene Epstein-sized monologue.
Okay, I guess two-part question. One, are there organizations that coordinate mobilization around dismantling zoning laws across the U.S.? And if not, is that an area where we could, promote liberty as putting forth a Free State project, almost like KIT, of like these are the tools you can use to dismantle these in your city, because it's such a pervasive national problem.
Yeah, YIMBY Action is the major group. Most of these are these YIMBY groups are local and state. California YIMBY is one of the most active ones. There's a YIMBY Town Conference. The next one's coming up in New Haven, Connecticut this year. So those are kind of the groups to get involved with.
Yeah, and it's, I think, politically low-hanging fruit in a weird way because it's not partisan yet. It will be. It will eventually become blue team or red team, but at the moment, it really is just, do you own a house or not? People that own houses don't like stuff. But it's so far it's really kind of local and it doesn't have to do with red team or blue team. Yeah.
Yeah, it's too bad we don't have a whole lot of time, but because this is something I'm really passionate about. From a more, honestly, like, against my libertarian nature, I really liked how you framed it, that it's like unethical, like indefensible but necessary kind of thing. I do agree with, I think what many people, younger homeowners especially, it has nothing to do with home value. I think that's kind of a red herring. I think as the boomers age out, I think it's less of a factor. We don't really care about it as much, millennials at least. I'm more in preserving the local character, even if that is to the economic detriment of the area, like willfully and knowing that. Because in my mind, I appreciate and understand your statistical analysis of everything ad nauseum. It's great. I'd love to take it offline. But as a rule, population density is more statist, necessarily so. You're sharing resources, you need bureaucracy. I'm sure there are exceptions that prove the rule, but that is my main concern. Tying into the greater Idaho movement, I want to avoid, you know, even if you have a 15% concentration of free staters moving in to a new 100-unit thing, you've now imported 15 free staters and 85, you know, non-free staters, potentially statists. You lose that every time through the miracle of democracy. That's what I'm concerned about, and that's it.
I think that's a misconception about population density, by the way. We look at this in correlation across the states, but I think that has a lot to do with like federal land and mineral resources that's driving low-density states to vote Republican. If you look at urbanization rates, the percentage of the population that lives in urban areas, there's no correlation to partisanship. And if you look abroad, some of the most libertarian places in Europe are cities, like Madrid, Spain, for whatever reason, elected a libertarian governor for several years, or classical liberal governor. You know, it's one of the most right-leaning parts of Spain. So historically, rural areas were often the most socialist. Oklahoma, Montana, big supporters of the socialists in the early 20th century. So yeah, I don't think population density is a problem. Some people hate density, and that's why I am absolutely open to neighborhood associations that have private contracts to limit density around them. I just don't want like a huge, you know, huge tracts of land involuntarily doing this to you know, large numbers of neighborhoods.
Yeah, I'll add to that. If I was reading you correctly, and I don't want to misspeak on you, but if you're thinking I'm going to use the power of the state in order to restrict population to try to fight the state, I think you've lost the plot. I don't think that restricting other people's private property in hopes that it avoids some kind of, I don't think that that's the way to go. I do appreciate, though, the, hey, there's a particular aesthetic that I like. I get that. I spend some time in Edinburgh every year. Edinburgh is beautiful. Yeah, I appreciate that, but it's also one of those things where, practically speaking, it's abused so frequently that I'm very hesitant to actually give power to it, and probably covenants are the way to go.